Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to have all of you here with us this evening. And I haven't met you, I'm Rabbi Faith Joy Dantowitz from Congregation Emeth and here in Morgan Hill. And we are so honored and delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, who I'm proud to say is a friend of mine as well. We're so welcoming Professor Pamela Nadell, and she holds the Patrick Clenenden Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program. Her book, America's Jewish Woman: A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year and was translated into Hebrew. The Atlantic journalist Franklin Foer has called her new book, Antisemitism: An American Tradition, quote, the book that the world needs now. Nadell is currently working on the museum plan for the rebuild of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, and she also, to her chagrin, may be best known for testifying in Congress with the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. And so I'm so excited for this conversation we're going to have for the next hour with Pamela. I have a lot of questions prepared, and I think it's going to fill up all of the time. If you can't wait and you have a question you want to ask later on, maybe I'll send a private message to Kathy Koenkis, who is helping co-host tonight, or send a message to me. But I think I have lots of questions that are hopefully on all of your minds. So I'm not sure if anybody has had a chance to read the book yet, but I am happy to highly recommend it, having just read the book. I'm just going to hold it up here. Don't have the author's signature yet because she's still on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast, but I look forward to having her sign it in person one day soon, and hope that many of you will take advantage of getting a copy and reading the book. So let's just start at the beginning, Pamela. And do you want me to call me Pam or Pamela? What do you prefer?
Either one. I'm happy with
I,
both.
I'll just call you either one. Okay. So so Pam, what led you to write this book, and why did we need a new book on American anti-Semitism at this moment?
Before I begin to answer your question, I just want to say to your congregation how fortunate they are to have you as a rabbi. What you didn't tell everyone was that we met when you were in New Jersey and you actually did the funerals of both my parents who did not belong to a synagogue. And you so touched my heart that when you reached out and you asked if I would speak, I didn't hesitate for a moment. I'm just sorry I can't be there in person, but you are very lucky congregation to have such a warm and really heartfelt rabbi. So thank you. And
Thank you.
so when I met you, I did not think I was going to ever write a book on anti-Semitism. This is not a post-October 7th book. This is a book that is really a post-Tree of Life book. On October 27th, 2018, as everyone here will surely remember, 11 Jews were murdered at prayer on a Shabbat morning at the Tree of Life Synagogue building in Pittsburgh. And I'm careful about how I phrase that because there were three different congregations meeting in that building, and members of each one were murdered. And what happened, that followed the Unite the Right rally, where white nationalists had marched through the University of Virginia chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And that had really shocked American Jews, and there was violence that accompanied that. Heather Heyer was murdered in a conflict the next day after that nighttime Tiki Torch March. But the murders at Tree of Life, that they left a terrible trauma in the community. I know that from going there so often to work on the rebuild. But this was a traumatic moment for all of American Jews, including my tiny little circle of American Jewish historians. And we began meeting and asking ourselves, how had we missed this story? And part of the reason we had missed it answers your second question, because the last really good book on anti-Semitism in U.S. history was published in 1994. And it ends in
Wow.
1994 with tremendous optimism. It's behind us, but it's not.
Wow, fascinating. So American Jewish historians, and I just want to share, I've written a few of the questions, and I want to share that many of these questions are ones that you shared with me that you received from Danny Green at Northwestern. So thank you for sharing those. Many American Jewish historians have debated whether the United States has been an exceptional place for Jews. The exceptionalism narrative often has imagined Jews as more welcome here than in other places and other times throughout history, and also as more safe from anti-Semitism than they have been in other places and at other times. Yeah, I wanted to quote from the book from actually the opening section where it says the history of American Jews is most often told as a celebratory story of how people persecuted overseas came to this country, found refuge, and ultimately succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of their immigrant parents, shaping what is arguably the most thriving diaspora community in all of Jewish history. So, after writing this book, where do you come down on this exceptionalism question? What do you think about that?
You know, it's so interesting. We were talking a few minutes ago, and you were reading Angela Bookdoll's wonderful new book, and she talks at towards the end of the book. She talks about also about the notion of American exceptionalism. She raises this is an idea that the United States is unique among all nations in the world, and the way the rabbi framed it makes it unique in terms of Jewish history, but it's an idea that's often been put forward that it's really a unique country and that no other country is at all like it. And for American Jews, I see the celebratory history is accurate. So many Jews in America did make it, did succeed, but it doesn't undermine the idea that anti-Semitism continued to thread through that history and that we had ignored that because we were so focused on the celebratory exceptionalist history.
Hmm, got it. It's nice to look at the positive things, right? I want to just
Yeah, it
focus on
is.
and then
And it's very it's so important. I was in a conversation with historians at NYU, and they said I had written a new history of the American Jewish experience that was very negative. And I said, no, I wrote a counterpoint that mine complements these other histories. It doesn't negate them, but it's part of the history that we had skipped.
Mm, wow. Well, sometimes anti-Semitism has functioned as a social prejudice in the US, and sometimes it's been enshrined in laws. I think it's less common in the US context to think about it enshrined in laws, but can you give us some examples of laws and though and put them into some context with other prejudicial laws in US history?
There, I think one of the things that's so striking is how much we forgot how much US legislation actually was also prejudicial against Jews. And there are many examples. I mean, I could talk about things like Sunday laws and blue laws from the colonial period in the 19th century. But the one that really jumps out, of
I
course,
lived in Bergen County for a while. They still have blue laws. So
right, right.
New
And
Jersey, in New
Washington,
Jersey.
D.C., I don't think you can buy alcohol until noon or something on Sundays. It's a remnant of the blue laws. But the thing that the blue law, I mean, there's so many, but the one that was really so striking is the immigration quota system. And of course, the establishment of the quota legislation, which has a version in 1921 and then gets really fixed in 1924 and does not end until 1965, which set limits on the number of immigrants who could come from particular countries. It's very clear when you read the congressional record that one of the major targets of that was to keep East European poor Jews out of the country. That's what they wanted to do. And then those laws, even when the quota was not being filled in Germany in the 1930s, and Germany had a higher quota, but then the US consuls were instructed not to grant visas, to kind of put paper walls up to make it really difficult for Jews to get out of Germany, where they were being persecuted in the 1930s and desperate to get into America. And of course, the family that, everybody knows about that doesn't make it it's Otto and Edith Frank and their daughters Anne and Margot. And they can't, even with the help of Nathan Strauss of Macy's department store, was actually a friend of Otto's who has flown over to Europe while Europe is already at war. He flies over to Europe. One of the affidavits needed to get into the country, they don't make it.
Um, huh. Today, we're hearing more and more often, that anti-Semitism functions as a conspiracy theory. So, what does this mean to say that anti-Semitism functions as a conspiracy theory? And is there something particular in the US context about how that conspiratorial theory works?
We're at a moment where there are a lot of that conspiracy theories seem to be sort of, proliferating all over the place, on the right, on the left, and that the idea of Jews as conspiring against the US, as controlling the media, controlling the banks, controlling the world to assert their own power, using it get privileges for Israel, using it to having created a Jewish state, for example. These are all, honestly, they're all variations on the granddaddy of all conspiracy theories, which is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, published in 1903 in Russia, brought to the United States by white Russians fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, translated by the U.S. Army under the auspices of the U.S. Army, and then published in the United States by Henry Ford.
We have some people here from Michigan, former Michigans. Um, yeah, wild. So Jewish responses, American Jews have responded to anti-Semitism in a variety of ways. Can you share with us a story or a couple of stories when there were particularly effective responses to it?
One of the most effective responses, which will really surprise people, was that during the buildup to World War II, so the 1930s, there was a spy ring, masterminded. It was in Los Angeles, and the mastermind behind it had actually worked at the Anti-Defamation League, and he hired all of these Germans to spy on the Nazis who were in who were, being, first of all, they were being funded by the Nazis from Germany. And they were, there was a really massive movement in the United States pushing the US to go towards fascism in the 1930s. And one of their plots, which this spy ring uncovered and then didn't materialize, was they planned to kidnap around 25 leading Jewish Hollywood figures, but also they were going to include Charlie Chaplin because he was a sympathizer. They were going to lynch them, and they hoped to start a nationwide pogrom that would then, go after all of the Jews. So that's one of the more fantastic stories.
Oof. Another story you want to share, or that's the one that
Um,
stands out right now?
I mean, that's the one that
Okay.
jumped out. Yeah, I mean, the others that jump. I mean, the other one that jumps out, of course, is Leo Frank. But Leo Frank ends in terrible tragedy.
Terrible tragedy, yeah. And
He's a
many of us went together to see Parade. The show was showing
ah,
in San Francisco last spring. So that was a very heavy show about the lynching of Leo Frank, owner of
and
the
and
pencil factory. Yeah.
the interesting thing about Parade, about the musical, is that when it was first written and appeared on Broadway and won the Tony for Best Play, it was not very successful because it was that moment that people were not, I think, didn't want to hear that story. How do you
Can
make a
you just fill in for people that aren't
yeah,
familiar with the
don't
story, just
know
to
it?
give a little, yeah.
Absolutely. In 1913, Leo Frank was a pencil factory manager from the North who had come to Atlanta And one of his workers, Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old child, was found murdered. Her body was found in the basement of the pencil factory. And the supposition was that Leo Frank, who had paid her pennies that she earned, had paid her wages that day, had murdered her. And what's interesting about, so he's accused, he's put on trial. His mother is so outraged by what's happening in that trial that she writes a letter that I found, which people hadn't noticed. I found it in the Washington Post, and she writes about the attacks on her son's faith. And it's very clear that had he not been convicted, there would have been a mob that would have gone in and lynched him. So he was convicted, sentenced to die. The day he was supposed to be executed, the governor of Georgia, well aware that Frank had been falsely convicted, because he was convicted on the testimony of an ex-convict African-American janitor. And as Frank's lawyer said at the end of the trial in his summation, he said, only a Jew could be convicted on that testimony in this courtroom. So when he was sentenced to life imprisonment, pardoned from execution, a mob broke into jail and lynched him in 1915. And literally last week, I got an email from somebody who said to me, she was from the South, and she said, when she was writing about experiences of anti-Semitism, somebody I don't know, she said, but the Leo Frank case always hung over us. And this is somebody who's writing in 2025. It left its mark.
Yeah, especially for Jews in Atlanta. So just a clarification, somebody asked about the blue laws. I could answer, but I want you to answer, like, what makes the blue laws anti-Semitic, and just to make sure we all know what blue laws are. Yeah.
Right. So the blue laws were laws that made sure that the states obeyed the Christian Sabbath. And they were not of themselves anti-Semitic, certainly, but they prohibited Jewish employment and Jewish activities on the Sabbath. And I'll give you just one example that really exercised a rabbi in Philadelphia in 18, because especially we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. In 1876, Philadelphia was the site of the big celebration, and there was an expo, a centennial celebration there, and they closed it on Sundays. And the rabbi in the town, there was a sizable Jewish community, he really felt that that was an infringement on his religious liberty, because he couldn't go on Shabbat and he couldn't go on Sunday. So it's not that they specifically targeted Jews, although there are cases that appear everywhere where Jews were called before the courts because somebody heard their sewing
Right,
machine
right.
whirring in their apartment building on a Sunday.
Wow, thank you for clarifying that. I'm going to jump around a little bit. So, campuses. There has been a lot of focus on campuses in the past couple of years. And I'm wondering if we could take a longer view on American Jewish students and anti-Semitism on campuses. There's a history here that your book explains. So I'm going to ask you, what is that history that you explain about the campuses?
The first thing to say about campuses is this is really a 20th century issue, because most people did not go to college in the 19th century, even though even then there was already restrictions. But what happens is that as the children of the East European immigrants and these flood into America and want to move up, they begin to flood into colleges and universities. And the very first one, as you would imagine, was Columbia, because it was in New York and you could commute to Columbia and go to school there. And there was also the City College of New York, which is a very important institution. But Columbia has so many Jews by the early 19 teens that it perceives that it has a serious Jewish problem. It actually ends up establishing this Seth Low College out, which I don't think I talked about in the book, but They end up establishing a college in Brooklyn where they admit the students, the Jewish men, to Columbia. They charge them the same tuition, but they send them to this college in Brooklyn to get them off of the main campus. What's better known than that story, however, is the story of the quotas. And when Harvard looks at what had happened at Columbia, is afraid that the right kind of man is not going to go to their school any longer. Harvard's in Boston. Boston has a large immigrant Jewish community. What happens is he proudly institutes a quota limiting the number of Jews. And he says on the front page of the New York Times, he says that how do you solve the Jewish problem? You establish a quota. There aren't so many there. It won't be a problem, and then everybody will get to know them. And then when they leave there, they will help to solve the plight of the Jews. What ultimately happens is that not only are quotas established at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the other Ivies, and at the women's colleges associated with them, but at 700 colleges and universities in the United States. And that quota system lasts until well after World War II.
And you've been at American University for how many years?
Oh, over 40.
So have you seen a change in the Jewish population? I don't know what the Jewish population is like in America, just as a snapshot
Yeah,
personally.
we're seeing a change now. There's, as you well know, Reform Judaism, the magazine, for a long time has published like a list of the top 50 colleges with then the size
Jewish
of the
population.
Jewish populations. And it's true, Jewish parents who are concerned about passing on Judaism to their kids steer them to a certain. It's really a pretty small group of colleges that they go to. And we've at American University, we have traditionally been about 20% Jewish in our undergraduate population. I'm hearing reports that it's actually declined in recent years. And we know that the schools that people are really excited about getting their kids into, a lot of them are now in the South. Vanderbilt, Tulane, and others, Emory in the South. But they also all have had issues.
Hmm. So looking at that history from the quotas, I mean, I'm thinking of when my own kids applied to some of the colleges years ago and felt like, oh, there are enough nice Jewish boys that applied from Millburn, New Jersey. They have enough, like it seemed like could it be harder to get in? I don't know. But what are we seeing today in terms of the rupture, in terms of anti-Semitism on campuses?
Uh,
Certainly in the last couple of years, but just maybe even longer than that.
right. So I think everyone here is familiar with the outburst after October 7th. And I would highlight, I think, maybe 2 points. The first one is what really happens on October 8th. 30 student organizations at Harvard um, blame Israel for all unfolding violence. This is before the war begins, and they denounce Israel, and it's really, I mean, it's just a horrible shock. It's partly what led to getting the president of Harvard hauled before that hearing, before that committee. And then by the spring of 2024, encampments have erupted. Those of us who've looked at the process of the encampments have noted that by and large, where did they break out? Mostly at well-to-do universities where students did not carry part-time jobs and could have the leisure
Mm.
to get involved with this. But what I wrote about in the book was everybody was shocked by what happened on October 8th. But the problem is it had been going on for 20 years. And I'll give you an example from the class I taught this morning. We're reading Deborah Lipstadt's Antisemitism Here and Now, a wonderful book. It was published in 2019. And we read the chapters called Toxifying Israel. And my students are saying, but this is, I mean, she had to have finished that book no later than January of 2019. And this is 6 years ago, and the descriptions and the things that were going on outside of, she doesn't really talk that much about social media, and there weren't encampments yet, but the students who were being targeted, the anti-Semitism being normative coming from certain sectors of the campus community, it was all there already. And I think people were wrongly shocked because they hadn't paid that much attention to about 20 years of BDS organizing, boycott, divestment, sanction organizing on college campuses.
So many follow-ups that I want to go. I'm going to stick to my program. So anti-Semitism is being weaponized by the current administration to attack the mission of universities. How do you understand this phenomenon at this moment?
Right. What makes our moment so difficult is that we have anti-Semitism on the left and we have anti-Semitism on the right simultaneously.
Yep.
We used to call the years between World War I and World War II, we used to call that the high tide of American anti-Semitism. But most of the anti-Semitism, was coming from Nazi sympathizers in the United States. It wasn't coming from the left. And now, what makes this moment so dangerous is coming from both places. And what we see in terms of the current expressions of it is that it has on both sides. It has super deep roots. The anti-Semitism from the left is coming straight out of um, actually Soviet Russia. The Soviets were they said they were not anti-Semitic, but they were anti-Zionist. And the anti-Semitism from the right is coming straight out of things that I could show you from the 19th century, where there were cartoons that could have been labeled "Jews will not replace us." So it's both. It's both at the same time.
Wow. So I want to follow up more about that with it on the left and on the right. It's both at the same time. Is there do you feel like one is worse than the other? It's just all bad, and it's all bad. It has to be
I,
called
w-
out
I,
everywhere.
I would have said that anti-Semitism from the right was worse than the anti-Semitism from the left until the arson attack on Josh Shapiro's home, until the murders of that beautiful young couple at the Capitol
Capitol
Jewish
Museum.
Museum, and then the firebombing of the demonstrators in Boulder. And then once you have um, violent deathly anti-Semitism coming from
Yeah.
the right, but
Yeah.
now it's also coming from the left. I can't make a decision about that. And I think this, because of the political polarization at this moment, it's always been really easy to call it out when it's not on your side. But
Sure.
if you don't pay attention to it on whatever political side you're on, there's a real problem that we can see right now. I mean, the Republicans are trying to grapple with it because they've just all of a sudden noticed that it exists in their ranks because of what the young Republicans were tweeting and because of Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. But it's always been there.
Well, I mean, but they're not just noticing. I'm thinking back to Charlottesville, with
Right.
the Unite the Right. So it's been in the Republican Party on display for a while. So I
Yeah.
don't know
Right.
how much it not being called out.
Right. But they're grappling with it in a way they hadn't had to before.
Okay. All right. So troubling. Um, might get to if you want to talk about your congressional hearing, or we can hold off on that question for a little bit. Do you
We
want
can,
to? Okay, sure.
I'm game, whatever you want.
Okay. So you were called in December of 23 to testify before Congress about anti-Semitism. Multiple times you've been called before Congress for that. But at that hearing, you sat alongside the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn. Can you tell us about that experience before Congress testifying about anti-Semitism?
The first time I testified in Congress was in November of 2017 after Charlottesville, when Congress was debating whether or not to legislate the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance to fix it into legislation. And I was opposed to that, not because I opposed the definition, but because I don't think Congress should be legislating something that keeps morphing and changing over time. You already asked me about, it's mostly a conspiracy theory. That's what some people are saying now. But that's not what that definition says. Um, and I had been in Congress also in November of 2023, which is how I found myself back in Congress in December of 2023. I will tell you, I almost didn't go. I called my
Mm.
editor. I said, every time you go to Congress, you have to write like this testimony, and which nobody reads, of course, but you write this testimony, which you have to summarize then in 5 minutes. And you have a clock in front of you, you can't go over. And I said to her, I just was there last month. They call me again, and I got to write another thing. I could, and I'm on sabbatical. I could have written a chapter of this book. I'm trying to make a deadline. So she says to me, just do it one more time. So in the end, I'm glad I did because it ended up getting. I mean, nobody paid attention to me back then, but now everybody notices that I came out with the book I said I was writing back then. So that's good for the book. It was. I knew when they got trapped. It was very clear what was going on, and I contemplated jutting in and saying, it's not really the answer you should be giving, because you should be saying, forget whatever your student conduct code says. If you call for genocide of population that happens to be on your campus, this is not acceptable behavior. But they were answering like lawyers, and they missed what's really going on there, and that is that these hearings are public performances. They are not court proceedings.
Wow. So, so let's talk about the expectation then that Holocaust education is an effective way to combat anti-Semitism, which you mentioned in the Holocaust Museum. There's a part in your book where you write about the 1980s and early 1990s as a moment when, quote, Holocaust education became embedded in Jewish and American memory. And today, some people are questioning whether Holocaust education really helps fight anti-Semitism. Do you have thoughts about that in this urgent time?
If it were successful in fighting anti-Semitism, we wouldn't be where we are right now. I mean, that's really my take on it. I Holocaust education is very, very important. Frankly, all history education is very important. And I asked, I actually had a conversation with my students. I love teaching because they're just, you learn from them. And I asked them what they had learned about the Holocaust, because they're all first years. So what did they learn about the Holocaust in high school? And this is after that they've gone down to the Holocaust Museum, and also we've talked about it in class. And they don't, I'm not blaming the educators, but they don't really learn very much about the Holocaust, just like they don't learn very much about anything that's historical. And they depending on the school that they went to, they came away with, a little bit of knowledge. But what was not emphasized was anti-Semitism leading to the Holocaust. And even as much as that, I think there are places now that are working on changing their curriculum around that. I'm just not sure that that's the way to teach this. And also, it then takes it back to Europe a long time ago, and it's not relevant to our students' lives because it happened,
Mm.
more than 75 years ago across the ocean. It would be much more relevant to discuss what's going on in terms of anti-Semitism in America so they could see it up close and personal.
Wow. But I mean, so many states mandate Holocaust
I
education.
know.
So you don't be saying that's not helpful. It just the way it's taught isn't helpful, or that
It,
they're not grasping
well,
it.
that it wasn't meant to solve the problem of
Got it.
anti-Semitism. I
Anti-Semitism,
think
right. It
people,
doesn't
I
solve it.
think
Yeah.
people thought it would,
Got
and
it.
I do think it's very important to teach it, but
Got it.
that's not how we solve the problem of anti-Semitism.
Got it. Got it. No, absolutely. So so you have a chapter called No Age is Golden, So, how did the story about the post-Holocaust years as a golden age for American Jews develop?
Obviously, the title is a response to Franklin Foer's The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending. Although I should tell you that even before he wrote that, about 2 years before he published that, I had debated the New York Times columnist Bret Stephens at the American Jewish Committee's Global Forum. And the debate was the question, is the golden age of American Jews over? And he, of course, was arguing it was, and I was arguing it wasn't, although I could have argued his side, but they assigned me the other side. Uh, that got me thinking about the claim of the golden age. So it sent me to do some research about, first of all, what are golden ages? And golden ages seem to be crafted in times where we're concerned about the present. So we're in crisis or whatever, and we go back and we're looking for an earlier time that we imagine is golden. And then something enabled me to prove that about these post World War II years. And that was, this is like, I apologize, I'm a nerdy historian. I just love sources. There's a news database called newspapers.com, and it's digitized newspapers
Oh,
from
wow.
across American history, from
Huh.
little towns. And if there's a Morgan Hill newspaper, it's in there. And
Wow.
it enabled me to search for attacks on Jewish synagogues, Jewish community centers, at an El
Hmm.
Al counter, and to build a little database of about 150 attacks that included arson and assault and attempted murder that had been during this period. And what I thought about it was it never made national headlines, but it left a mark. And I'll tell you a story about how much that I knew it had left a mark, because after I was working on the book, every time I would see somebody, I would ask, did they ever experience anti-Semitism? So I was talking to a really good friend who wrote this fabulous book on Cold War Jews, and the Soviet Jewry movement. His name's Shaul Kellner, teaches at Vanderbilt, and he says, no, of course I grew up in New Jersey. No, there was no, and he's younger than me. And then he says, well, there was the time that those guys stole a bulldozer and they bulldozed down the wall of the new synagogue. So I thought,
Oh,
oh, okay. So I go to newspapers.com, find the local Jewish newspaper, and they also wrote on that wall, into the ovens with the Jews. So it's people always said those kinds of things, they only came from hoodlums, but there was so much of it, but it was just under the radar because nobody could go through all those newspapers until you could just click on them.
that's fascinating to be able to get all that data. Wow. Well, yeah, I mean, there are incidents that are popping up all the time now, and we see it right away because of social media, right? Or we see what it hits our social media streams. Huh. Um, I wanted to go back to something you referenced a little bit earlier about white nationalism. And Eric Ward wrote this powerful article, Skin in the Game. Maybe you can share for people who haven't read the book or don't know about Eric Ward, who Eric Ward is. And then I want to ask you a question about white nationalism being based on anti-Semitism.
Eric Ward is somebody I'm proud to call a friend. He's a remarkable, remarkable, courageous individual. He grew up in Los Angeles. He's a man of African American descent, and he describes himself in this article, "Skin in the Game," which was published just a few weeks before the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And he describes himself as a Los Angeles punk. So I'm not calling him that. He's calling himself that. And as he moves into working for social justice and racial justice. And in the 1990s, he realized that the only way he could really understand the white nationalist movement would be to go and hang out with those white nationalists. So you have to get an image of this black man going to these white nationalist meetings. This is long before everything's, only in the dark web or on the internet. And and what happens there is that he kind of cozies up to them, and they reveal to him that they are convinced, and this is his argument, the second part of your question, they reveal that they are convinced that people of color are simply incapable of accomplishing what they have accomplished, to overturn Jim Crow, to get the statues of, and this is a little bit later, but to get the statues of Confederates torn down, and that therefore there is a mastermind behind them who is pulling the puppet strings. And those are the Jews. So it's classic conspiracy theory, and that the Jews are cunning. And then the other thing that he discovers is they also say the Jews are so cunning that they have fooled the world into thinking they're white. But of course, we, meaning the white nationalists, we know that they are not white. So you have at this moment where we're talking about anti-Semitism from two sides. You have the left accusing the Jews of being white colonial settlers in Israel, and then you have the right saying that they're very happy to have Jews go back to Israel, but they don't belong in America because they're not really white people.
Wow. So, can you say more about how this shows up throughout American Jewish history and how it's connected to the current administration?
It's connected to the current administration because there are so many Christian nationalists, some white nationalists in the current administration. And because Project 2025, which of course was not supposed to be implemented by the current administration, but this is a program that if it has its way, it will reestablish Christian nationalism. And what people don't always remember is that just as anti-Semitism is a Jewish tradition, proclaiming America a Christian nation is also an American tradition. I meant anti-Semitism is an American tradition. Proclaiming Christianity as the state faith is also an American tradition. The founding fathers did not do that, but within 25, 30 years or so of the founding of the United States, we have people who are going back to look at the founding documents, the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, who are asserting that the problem with those documents is that they just sort of assumed America would be Christian and they didn't say it specifically. So by the time we get to the Civil War, there's an amendment introduced in Congress to add that this is a nation under God and Jesus Christ. And it never passes, but the organization promoting the Christian Amendment to the Constitution exists well into the 20th century. And at one point, it's headed by a Supreme Court justice. It's the idea that what's wrong with America is that God's punishing the country because it's not formally Christian, doesn't formally adhere to Jesus Christ. And we are honestly at a moment where people in the current administration, adjacent to the current administration, would love to see America become a Christian nation.
Do you see that as a possibility?
I don't think it'll happen. I really don't. Every other time it's been raised, it didn't happen. If the Democratic Republic that we have, small d, small r, if it survives, democratic republics do not always survive. We're in a moment with tremendous infringement on sort of the normal operating procedure of our federal government. But if it survives, it won't happen. If it doesn't survive, then everything's up for grabs, right?
I know. Well, we're counting on you to help us survive. What do we need to do to make sure it survives? Oh my
I
gosh.
think we need to understand that anti-Semitism, everybody keeps saying this, it's not a Jewish problem. That's true. It's not a Jewish problem. It's actually a problem of the people who are the anti-Semites, but it's actually a tremendous problem for democracy. So when
Right, right.
I mean, take a look at the Weimar Republic, and when you think of how anti-Semitism was weaponized to overturn the Weimar Republic, but you can also take a look at other countries in Europe in the 1920s and the 1930s, where anti-Semitism was also weaponized to overthrow the existing republics. And they did, they succeeded. Um, that's the real problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The democracy and anti-Semitism, yeah, anti-Semitism can destroy it. So that is definitely a challenge. I think you mentioned allies in the book, and we cannot combat anti-Semitism on our own.
Mm.
Yet after October 7th, when many Jews experienced a distressing alienation from our allies, and now there's a Zionist litmus test, many Jews have felt the need to build walls that we can only count on other Jews, whereas many, myself included, emphasize bridges that we need to do in our interfaith work. What does history show us about this, about a response?
I would say that the first thing that history shows us is that when, to go back to the post-World War II period that we talked about before, when did things get better for Jews in that golden age? Why did we think it was a golden age? It was a golden age because the federal government had passed legislation prohibiting discrimination. And just as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 benefited African Americans and women, people forget about the benefits for women, just as it benefited those two groups, it also benefited American Jews. So the first ally, and it's right, it's very hard at this moment in time, but the first ally needs to be governments, and maybe not federal government at the moment, but certainly local governments and state governments, and that they are sort of the first line of defense. And then I like your comment very much about the faith communities, because while a lot of progressive places have for a long time now had a Zionist litmus test, that's not brand new, but I think the faith communities are want to work together on this, and that's something that we really need to do. We need to build bridges. We need to rebuild bridges. And Israel has made it very hard. It's really made a very difficult situation. What happens in Israel doesn't stay in Israel. It affects American Jews.
Right. And I want to welcome my colleagues from the interfaith community who are with us on this call right now, actually Bishop Mark Fulmer and other members of the interfaith community. We believe in working together. We think that's really important for all of us to build those bridges. I also wanted to share a question from Eve, who asked, how can small synagogues or communities build resilience when anti-Semitism feels so widespread? Do you have any recommendations for that?
I know that, and I'm sure, and maybe you saw this in the synagogue, that anti-Semitism often has a paradoxical effect. It endangers Jews. It also strengthens their Jewish identity. And everybody talked about the surge where Jews wanted to be in community after October 7th and began to turn out. And I think it's like building concentric circles, right? So that circle of the community that's uplifting us and keeping us, together, and helping us feel like we've got each other's back, which will then turn into resilience. But it's also so important to have those allies. And I join you in welcoming your interfaith colleagues. That's really wonderful.
Great. A few more questions. Many of the ways in your book the language you use in describing acts of anti-Semitism are increasing. It's through kind of the imagery of water, like a rising tide. That's often how we see it, like it's increasing, the tides are rising. And I gave a sermon on Kol Nidre about dismantling anti-Semitism. It's been on a webinar with Ben the Ark, and Sharon Goldstick had done languaging about that and really focused on the idea of dismantling it, explaining anti-Semitism more as a machine that's fueled and used by people. So I'm just wondering what you think about a framework. Is that a helpful framing to like approach combating it, reframing the language that we use, or is it just rises and falls? Like how do you approach understanding it going up and down,
Oh,
anti-Semitism, or is it just fueling it, like white
I
nationalists are fueling it? So,
right. I really like that idea of a machine. I should tell you, historians don't like the word anti-Semitism because the word anti-Semitism, and you saw in the
oh,
book,
you explain it. I didn't share that.
the
Yeah,
word
explain the word.
anti-Semitism is not invented until the late 1870s. And before that, we have anti-Judaism. One of my colleagues says we should talk about Judeophobia. But for historians, to collapse all these different expressions of Jew hatred under one term, let alone one term that was created in the late 1870s, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And they debate this. In fact, there's a new book out called On Anti-Semitism, which is analyzing, how the word had one meaning in Europe, and then once Israel got established, it ended up with a different meaning. And that we would really honestly be better off with a different term, better off just using something like Jew hatred, because each anti-Semitism coming from the left may have the same impact on Jews as anti-Semitism coming from the right, but its origins are different, its expressions are different, and what it hopes to achieve is different also depending on the particular case. So I like your idea of kind of unpacking it in a different way and trying to come up with some different kinds of metaphors for how to understand it. We're living through a moment where anti-Semitism has become normalized. And we hadn't seen that before. But if I were talking in the 1930s, Jews would have just known. I mean, that was just part of the world that they lived in. It limited where they went to school, where they could live, what kinds of jobs they could have. And we're beginning to see some of that again, especially in the boycotts. And so, in the publishing industry and in so many other
Right.
places. Right.
Oh yeah, the publishing industry has been really difficult, right? So many
Yes.
fields. But as you talk about normalizing, I'm thinking about, when my youngest son graduated college in 2023 from Northeastern, and there's a little bit of an uprising at Fenway Park where people are going to start protesting, and they managed to squash it. The dean just spoke out and said, like, this is the day for celebration, and the
Um,
protesters stopped. And I felt like, okay, like, it was fine. There's like only a little disruption, like what we normalize, like in terms of what we're willing to deal with, or like it wasn't so bad. But then another son was just sharing a bit with me before our call tonight, with the comedian Alex Edelman, who has
oh,
like
I
a
love
whole
Alex Edelman.
whole
I saw
comedy
his new
routine about
show.
anti-Semitism, right? And like people saying like anti-Semitism, it's horrible. It's like never been worse than ever before. And people are like, really? Like, was your family member like shot and like killed in their home? It's like, oh my God, I can't walk across campus. Like I go to Columbia and I can't walk. And that's terrible. But it's like this spectrum of like what we expect for where anti-Semitism is today. And so it definitely feels a lot worse than it's felt in decades past. I know at my last synagogue, we're like, oh, like it's going to be so hard to teach the kids about anti-Semitism. I was living in a place in New Jersey where there's so many, like 30-40% Jewish population in the community, like they're not going to understand what anti-Semitism is. And now it's like, oh, I wish that was a challenge to explain what is anti-Semitism. Now it's people
And
know what Jews know
and
what it is.
you're also getting back to why I called it an American tradition, because we didn't have pogroms by and large, and we didn't have state-sponsored mass murder. So therefore, how bad could it be, right? But that's what the history that was written in 1994 is talking about. By the end of that book, the worst thing he can think of to write about in the 1960s is school board election, where anti-Semitism figures into it. But what I've read, and we had talked about campuses before, as you know, many campuses established anti-Semitism task force. Like all good academics, they have published enormously long reports. Columbia is actually issuing 4, and I've read some of the reports. And when you read what happened to Jewish students on campus, whether somebody says That's just anti-Zionism. It's not anti-Semitism, but it really doesn't matter because the Jewish student who was barred from entering part of UCLA, it doesn't matter whether it was because he was a Zionist or the people protesting were anti-Zionist, but he remembers that as a Jew, he couldn't walk across his campus. And he's going to carry that memory through a lifetime. And that's
Right.
actually what got me into writing the book, was hearing stories carried across a lifetime.
And that's actually a story from my predecessor. Her granddaughter was at UCLA during that time period, and she couldn't get to some of her classes because she couldn't walk safely across the campus. So, and other students that we have at other campuses at Berkeley, other places. Um, just to note, like here in California, legislation has happened of combat, against anti-Semitism with the passing of AB 715, which is the first in the nation law to counter anti-Semitism in K to 12 schools. So that'll be interesting to see if that's something that will happen in other states or if that's going to be only in California. But a couple more things. As I shared with you when I wrote to you, said, some of the stories in your book that you shared were just gruesome. Like I grimaced when I was reading. They were so violent, from the individual attacks to like pogroms, and that I certainly didn't know about any of that. If you could jump to the future, just imagine yourself in the future and you're living to like past 120, looking back, what might you write about the experiences of the past couple of years?
Certainly, I will need another chapter to the book. There's no question. As I said at the very end, historians need distance. I do talk a little bit about the aftermath of October 7th, but I didn't have the distance. And I'm already thinking, I'm not sure when I'm going to have time to do this, but I really need to sit down with those anti-Semitism task force reports and look at the breadth of what these young people were facing. And I know because from what people told me when I was on tour with America's Jewish Women, and they told me stories of anti-Semitism that had happened, sometimes decades, in a few cases, even half a century before. And we might have called some of those incidents microaggressions. Some of them were way more than microaggressions, but they never forgot them. And it made me realize that experiencing anti-Semitism is part of what it means to be a Jew, whether it was in Europe during the Holocaust or it's in America in 2025.
Wow. At the end of the book, you mention anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I think you might even mention them together. So this is a huge area of contention in the Jewish and the non-Jewish community. So I'm wondering, how do you suggest explaining this to a 20 plus something or an 80 plus someone who sees anti-Zionism separate from anti-Semitism? How do you look at them separately and how do you look at them together?
The first thing to say is there's beginning to be a serious conversation among scholars about this. We've written a ton about anti-Semitism. We haven't written that much about anti-Zionism. That's the first point. But I have been thinking about this. One scholar I'm following talks about anti-Zionism as its own discrete form of bigotry and prejudice, but it's adjacent to anti-Semitism. And I want to remind people of what anti-Semitism led to in the past. And I'll use just two examples. The first was in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, when it was established, outlawed anti-Semitism, but it was decidedly anti-Zionist. And you will remember that when Jews wanted to leave the Soviet Union and emigrate to the state of Israel, that they were sent to Siberia, they were fired from their jobs, they became refuseniks, and they were seriously persecuted. And in the end, many emigrated as things opened up somewhat in the Soviet Union and then after its collapse. So that essentially, I don't know what the size of the Soviet Jewish population or former Soviet Union Jewish
Mm.
population is today, but anti-Zionism led to certainly the decimation of the Soviet Jewish community. The second example is actually much starker, and that is that anti-Zionism led to the end of the Jews of Iraq and North Africa and Iran, of the Middle East. That when the state of Israel was established, that the Jews were targeted in these historic communities. They had lived in Iraq since the Babylonian exile. In 1948, Iraq declares any Zionist activity illegal. Within 3 years, 96% of about 150,000 Jews left Iraq. Same thing happens in Yemen, in Algeria, in Morocco, that in Egypt. The Jews of North Africa and the Jews of the Middle East left their historic homelands because of anti-Zionism. And about, I mean, the figures range, I see things between 700,000 and 850,000. Many ended up going, of course, to the new state of Israel. Others went elsewhere, including to the United States. But you can't, I think people don't understand the ramifications of what anti-Zionism is.
Thank you. Um, Anti-Semitism is millennia old, as you shared in your book. Do you think it will be around forever?
Yeah, I do. It's
Mm,
really so depressing. Um, the great historian Robert Wistrich, he calls it the lethal obsession. He writes 1,000-page books about anti-Semitism. I think if it hadn't reemerged in such a stark way since 2016, 2017, it was there before, but it was tamped down, but it hadn't disappeared. But now it's so virulent. And of course, the web is just, social media is just a horror.
wow. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you're like, I really want to add something about this topic?
I want to hold out hope because I think that we are all, and I'm sure everybody in this meeting is thinking about this, we're all trying to do what we can to improve the situation. And not just for Jews, but frankly for immigrants, for people of color, for Asian Americans, for Latino Americans who have all faced terrible hate in recent years. And that we're all trying to plant the seeds to improve the world around us. And all we can do is plant them. We may not be around to reap them, but I keep thinking of, the psalm, those who sow in tears will
Tears,
enjoy,
reap and joy.
will reap in joy. And that is my hope for the future.
Amen to that. I hope we all can plant and maybe even get to reap some of it as well. It has been such an honor to speak with you. I'm just going to hold up the book again for everybody to see, Antisemitism in American Tradition, Pamela Nadell. And I don't know, I got a few questions that were sent in the chat, and we're at the hour. So unless somebody sends me one right now, I think we're gonna wrap up. I want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's really been an honor to share this time with you. It's so informative to read your book. Kathy just posted again. If you'd like to buy a copy of her book, a great place to do so is bookshop.org. That's great to work of our indie bookstores like Booksmart and Morgan Hill or anywhere you like to shop. Amazon also delivers books. And if you're going to go on Amazon, definitely rate it and let people know about this book so um,
Thank
can do well. But thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you in person when you do make your way out to California to the Reform Rabbis
you.
Convention
I'll see you in San
this
Francisco.
spring. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all for taking the time to join us tonight. We're really happy that so many of you could join us tonight for this conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Good night.
Good night. Yes, good night. It's very late on the East
It's
Coast.
late
Good
on
night.
my end.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Be well.